Okay, so here we are with Jeopardy! Chapter 3. All right, so 100, nonverbal communication for 100. Let's see. What are the 5 basic emotions that can be inferred from our facial expressions? What is anger, fear, happiness, sadness, and disgust? In fact, what is the universal expression? Yes, a smile. Nonverbal for 200. When is a high level of eye contact a negative thing? What is when staring? So for instance, they say that you want to avoid extended eye contact with aggressive drivers because you might encourage them to do something more than stare. Nonverbal communication for 300. How can body language provide useful information about others? What is? It can reveal information about others' emotional states. For instance, if somebody is making a large number of movements or movements at a greater frequency, that might indicate a high level of arousal. Nonverbal communication for 400. How are gestures, specifically one category called emblems, which are body movements, culture specific? What is, in some countries, these movements have clear and definite meanings, whereas in other cultures, they may have no meaning or an entirely different meaning or meanings. So for instance, the thumbs up sign might mean that hey, that's great in our culture, but it might mean up yours in another. Or the okay sign, here we know it's like, woohoo, good job. Whereas in another, it might mean a body orifice. Nonverbal communication for 500. What does the meaning of touch depend on? What is? Who does the touching? The nature of the physical contact? And the context in which the touching takes place. So, for instance, if it's a friend or a stranger, a man or a woman, it depends on the duration of the touch, the degree, the body area touched. If it's in a business setting, a social setting, a doctor's office, all these things can mitigate the meaning of touch. Nonverbal cues for 100. The view that facial expressions can actually trigger emotions is known as what? What is the facial feedback hypothesis? I always joke around that if I'm in an aggravated mood, I'll strike a big old smile, and I'll say smile therapy, because if I smile, then it will make my brain think that I'm happy and put me in a better mood. Nonverbal cues for 200. How is paralanguage a more accurate guide to people's emotions than their words? Well, first, a paralanguage is a type of nonverbal communication involving vocal effects other than speech. So, because often people express emotions through sounds independent of their words they speak, that is why paralanguage is a more accurate guide to people's emotions. So if I say, I'm fine, the words I'm fine may not check out with the way that I said it in a growling manner. Nonverbal cues for 300. What are the nonverbal cues reflective of people who are in love? What are smiles, head nods, leaning in toward one another, and positive gestures? So hand holding, mutual gazing, all that indicates that people are in love. Nonverbal cues for 400. How can nonverbal cues impact an applicant's job interview performance? What is? Through time talked, gestures, smiling, and posture. So, for instance, slouching results in less success in a job interview And a powerful posture positively influences others' perceptions of us, as well as it boosts our confidence. Nonverbal for 500. What are some nonverbal cues indicative of deception? What is micro-expressions, interchannel discrepancies, and exaggerated facial expressions? So, micro-expressions are fleeting facial expressions that only last for a few tenths of a second. So if we frown and then quickly smile, that's a micro-expression. Interchannel discrepancies are discrepancies between facial expressions and body language. So we might manage to manage our facial expressions but avoid eye contact, or vice versa. And then exaggerated facial expressions are like, an example of that would be increased frequency of smiling or smiling more broadly. Any of those would be indicators of lying. Attribution for 100. The process that describes how we use information about others' behavior as a basis for inferring their traits defines which theory? What is correspondent inference? So others' engagement in unusual behavior, typically socially undesirable behavior, provides us with useful information for understanding their traits. So if we see that mother yelling like above average in a grocery store, we might think that she's just more hostile towards her kid. Attribution for 200. According to Kelly's covariation theory, what preliminary question do we ask when we're trying to understand why a behavior occurs? What is, did the behavior result from internal causes, external causes, or some combination? So did I not get promoted because of my lack of performance, which is an internal cause, or because of biased evaluators, which is an external cause? Attribution for 300. What are the three major types of information that we focus on when we're trying to understand why a behavior occurs? What is consensus, consistency, and distinctiveness? So you want to be able to define each of these and know how varying levels of these dimensions can translate into attributions about internal causes, external causes, and combinations of the both of internal and external. Attribution for 400. What are the two other dimensions of causal attributions, in addition to consensus, consistency, and distinctiveness? What is the stability of causal factors over time and the controllability of the factors? Attribution for 500. Erica watches Anne place her change in a jar and thinks that she did this because she doesn't want to lose her change. James watches the same behavior and concludes that Anne placed the change in the jar because she's saving for her education. What is this an example of? What is action identification? And what you'll see is basically this is the interpretation that we place on an act. And it differs in terms of degree of abstraction. So, for instance, a low-level interpretation would be the one that was posed by Anne, and a high-level interpretation would be the one that was posed by James, because he attempted to explain the cause of that behavior rather than just observing the cause. Okay, attribution errors and application for 100. All right, so we have this scenario. The professor shows up to class 10 minutes late, drops her notes, the glasses fall off when she picks up her notes, and later she spills her coffee during the class break. which explanation would most people likely choose to explain these events? That she's either disorganized and clumsy, or that she must have gotten caught in traffic, causing her to become flustered and having this domino effect of aversive events occur. Bum, bum, bum. Explanation A. We basically attribute her behavior due to internal factors, and this inclination is referred to as correspondence bias, also known as the fundamental attribution error. Okay, attribution errors for 200. How does culture modify the fundamental attribution error? What is? Those in collectivistic cultures are more likely to recognize more of the situational determinants of behavior than members of individualistic cultures. So members of collectivistic cultures are somewhat less likely to make the fundamental attribution error as a result. Okay, errors for 300. Why does correspondence bias occur? What is? Because we tend to focus on the actions of another when observing the individual's behavior. So the situational causes of behavior seem to fade away, and dispositional or internal causes become more salient to us than situational or external causes. In this case, the person is high in perceptual salience. Attributions for 400. Okay, upon the professor handing back papers in class, Jane notices that her classmate Greta got the same failing score as she. She thinks to herself that she received that score because she didn't put the time into the paper, whereas Greta received that score because she's not so bright. What is this type of bias known as? The actor-observer effect. This is the tendency to attribute our own behavior to situational or external causes, but the behavior of others to dispositional or internal causes. Okay, the last error for 500. Depressed people attribute negative outcomes to internal causes, but attribute positive outcomes to external causes, which is the opposite of which type of bias? What is the self-serving bias? So the self-serving bias is the tendency to attribute our own positive outcomes to internal causes, but negative outcomes to external causes. And depressed people have a pattern that's opposite of this. So therapy would work on changing the pattern of the depressed person's attributions so that they take credit for their successes and view their successes as a result of internal factors, and they avoid self-blame for their failures, especially uncontrollable ones, or they view some failures as a result of external factors. Okay, impression management for 100. What is the relationship between central traits and impression formation? What is? We don't simply form impressions by adding up the traits we observe. Rather, we see how an individual traits are related to each other so that we see them as one integrated person. So central traits are those traits that strongly shape the overall impression of a stranger. Impression formation for 200. We quickly and accurately form first impressions of others on which characteristic? Threat. 300. How can first impressions be changed? By reinterpreting information that produced the initial impression. Alright, impression formation for 400. When can impression management tactics backfire? when we overuse them.